should have been, because many Delta Nats people already know Liron. He hasn't presented to Delta Natural Society, but he has presented on a couple of occasions to our annual Birds in Focus, visual presentation, at which many Delta Nats people attended. Anyway, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We will talk about a few things. Liron swept the youth category in the 2018 Audubon Photography Awards. He's still only 20. His work has been seen in Canadian Geographic and a number of other prestigious publications, as well as in some of the largest museums around the world. He's currently a biology student at UBC, and he uses his photography to educate and connect people to nature, to try to inspire them to cherish and protect our increasingly fragile planet. This is really what his goal is as a photographer. One of the things that wasn't in the bio in the newsletter is that Liron and some of his friends spent many, many hours on bicycles, riding around, looking for birds and raising money for Birds Canada. I think it was called the Great Canadian Birdathon. But
yeah, that's correct.
I thought it was. And I think you did it this year as well, didn't you?
Yeah, this was the maybe the 7th year in a row and the 3rd year in a row on bikes.
Yeah. And I think you did pretty well raising some money too.
Yeah. I think as a team, I'm trying to remember, but I think it was kind of $5,000 or so that we raised this year. So.
Wow, fantastic. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about the salmon run. And I think you've got lots of footage from under the water and on the land and around the water, all culminating in the great gathering where all of the bears and birds and heaven only knows what else come and enjoy the salmon. So I'll let you get on with your program. Thank you.
Excellent. So is everyone able to see my screen now? Is it visible?
Yes,
yeah, okay, I'm seeing some notes. Great. Yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction, Elizabeth. It's so great to be here, even if it's virtual. I've missed presenting for the Delta Nats. Yes, I last saw many of your faces in April, so it's very nice to be back here now. And as Elizabeth said, I am going to be presenting about the Great Gathering, this annual salmon run that we have here in British Columbia and in other places in the world. But I'll be focusing on, particularly this part of British Columbia, the spectacle of the fish heading up the rivers and all the other animals that you see during the spawning season and the greater benefits that it has for the whole ecosystem. So, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the salmon run, but it's really a highlight of the year for me in terms of just a spectacle that you can enjoy out in nature. And depending of where you are in BC, it might start as early as like June up further north, and down here it can continue all the way into January, even February a little bit. And right now, even as was being discussed earlier in the meeting, is definitely prime time to see these incredible fish heading up the streams. And this image here is a top-down view of 4 sockeye salmon heading up a small stream in the Fraser Valley. But, the journey of these incredible fish, it begins and it ends in these rivers, but the majority of the life of a salmon is spent in the ocean. So I thought we'd start off by taking a look at the sea creatures, these particularly marine mammals that survive largely off of the salmon. At least, the salmon make up a large part of their diet. And perhaps a great example of that are sea lions. So pictured here are some stellar sea lions. This is on the outer coast of Vancouver Island near Tofino. And you can see there's one really, really large, very large male stellar sea lion kind of in the center left, if you can see my mouse right here. Ruling over this rock, and they are just such charismatic marine animals. And although they're very clumsy on land, if you've seen them, they're really, really graceful when they're swimming around in the water. So So here's a closer look at these animals. And I find sometimes in photography, it can be hard to give a sense of scale. But hopefully with this picture here, with this glaucous wing gull in the foreground, you can see the size of these. And these aren't even, as big as sea lions can get. But these are some females and young males with that gull for scale. And when you look at the skull of a stellar sea lion, it really resembles that of like a grizzly bear. And if you go far back enough, they did share a common ancestor. So these are kind of like, even though they might act kind of like dogs and puppies of the ocean, they are kind of like bears in terms of their structure. And here's a real close-up. Sometimes when you're out in boats, the sea lions get really, really curious. And sometimes they'll just pop up right next to you. And I just love getting that chance to observe them up close, see all those details, every single whisker. And these sea lions, definitely the salmon and the other fish that the salmon are closely tied to are definitely an important part of their diet. But it's not just the sea lions. There's other marine mammals as well, like this little harbor seal here, which, I love the fact that the harbor seal is one of those marine mammals that you can see even from the city, downtown Vancouver, certainly all around Delta, Tawasin. In the ocean, you can see these harbor seals. And this here is a close-up of a mother and her calf harbor seal. Really, really very adorable and beautiful animals. And unlike the sea lions, the harbor seals lack the flexible pelvic girdle that lets sea lions kind of stand up and move around on land. So often the harbor seals will just wait for the tide to drop in order to get themselves out of the water. And they can flop into the water and flop around on land if needed, but they're certainly a lot less maneuverable on land compared to the sea lions. So this past summer, I had the opportunity to use some underwater housing for my DSLR setup. It was loaned to me for a few weeks by a company called Aquatech. So it was an introduction to the underwater world for me, and you'll see a lot more photos from that later on in the presentation. But just to get a chance to take a picture like this of a harbor seal underwater is something I will definitely not forget soon. They're such remarkable animals, especially when they're moving around in the water and swimming. And one more of these small marine mammals is the sea otter. And, perhaps many of you are familiar with this story, but the sea otter was hunted to extinction or local extinction on the BC coast for their fur. And I believe it was maybe in the 20s or 30s when they completely disappeared from the coast here. In future decades, they reintroduced them. They brought some from Alaska back to the BC coast, and they are now once again regaining their numbers. But their fur nearly made them disappear forever in British Columbia. And if it wasn't for the reintroduction, we might not have them, because they do have the thickest fur of just about any animal. But these sea otters are also closely related to the salmon. They might not eat salmon, but some of their favorite food are these guys, these sea urchins. And basically the sea urchins their favorite food are these kelps and seaweeds underwater. So like you can see on the right, a big kelp underwater, and on the left, these sea urchins that are clearing a rock of some algae underwater. And these kelps and algae actually provide very important habitat for young fish, such as young salmon, in the ocean. So when you have no sea otters in the area is when you see things like this. You see these huge populations of sea urchins. But when you've got sea otters around, they tend to keep the sea urchin populations more in balance, which allows for the growth of these kelp forests, which is good habitat for fish, including salmon, in the ocean. Of course, if you live in BC, we have some of the most emblematic marine creatures on the planet here in the form of our orcas. And orcas are very, very closely tied to salmon as well, as I'm sure you know. So pictured here is a male and female pair of transient orcas. So these transient orcas eat marine mammals, so they're not eating the salmon directly, but the salmon are an important food source for the marine mammals that they're eating, like seals and sea lions. So indirectly, the salmon are definitely important to these transient orcas. And here is another look at the transient orcas. The transients are really remarkable animals. They're very large orcas. They're larger than a lot of orca populations in the world. I actually think, I should double check, but I think they might be the largest orcas in the world. And they live in these small family groups. It's often like a mother and a couple of her offspring. Almost all orcas, with very few exceptions, live in matriarchal societies. So the eldest female and her knowledge and her rule governs the family. And these orcas are just really, really remarkable animals. So beautiful, such like a emblematic animal of the BC coast. So these are the transient orcas, and they're the ones that are eating the marine mammals, which feed on salmon. But of course, we also have resident orcas in British Columbia. This here is a northern resident orca in northern Vancouver Island. And for the resident orcas, salmon are a very critical food source. And as I'm sure we're all aware, with our southern resident orcas here in the Salish Sea, they are eating almost entirely Chinook salmon in particular. But salmon are very important for these orcas. And spending a lot of time on the water is important for having those special photographic opportunities. So I've been fortunate to do a little bit of partnerships and work with some of the ecotourism companies around Vancouver Island, which enabled me to spend quite a bit of time on the water. And after a lot of trips, you sometimes get some special encounters. In this case, we were watching some humpback whales off in the distance, and all of a sudden in the distance, we spotted a pod of orcas, and they just kept coming towards us and shut the engines off, and they pretty much swam right under the bow of the boat and continued on. Just an incredible magical encounter early in the morning. Here's another look at a northern resident orca. And you can see in the background there a kelp bed, which is a great place for salmon and for marine mammals. So these kelp beds are very productive places where you often find things. And as a result, these orcas often spend time around the kelp beds as well. So this here is a picture from a few years ago of a southern resident orca. As you know, these are endangered orcas. And there's a lot of uncertainty around what exactly has caused the population to drop to around 75 individuals, and no one knows anything 100% for sure, but certainly some of the leading theories are that they are having trouble finding enough salmon to eat, and they need the Chinook salmon, as I mentioned. So we all have a duty, and we'll talk about this more, but there's so many things that all of us can do to preserve this ecosystem, and the orca may be at the top of the food chain, but as a result of being such a large, emblematic, beautiful animal, I think it's a good way for people to connect to this ecosystem, even though they're not supporting the foundation like the salmon, just by being such an animal that humans can form such a connection with. They are definitely important ambassadors for this coastal ecosystem. So this here is a southern resident in the J-pod. Her name is Tsuchi. And I believe maybe last February or either this year or the last year, she gave birth to a calf. And it's very exciting because obviously every calf that is born is great news for the southern residents. And this here is another one of the southern residents, Mako. And this is the only time I've actually ever seen an orca breach. And when it comes with photographing whales that are breaching, there is certainly a lot of luck that is involved. There's definitely, some skills to be learned there, and that, kind of predicting where the whales are going to come up. can be important. And when you're in choppy waters like this, just kind of being able to stabilize against the waves can take some learning. But when it comes to just a whale doing a single breach out of nowhere, you kind of have to be already pointing your lens in the right direction if you're going to have a chance at photographing it. And luckily, I was pointing my lens in the right direction when this happened, and I managed to capture this image of Mako breaching out of the water. I find, often these whales, you were observing them from quite far away, but when they breach out of the water like this, you just realize how huge they are, and all of a sudden they can fill much more of your image. These are bus-sized creatures, or van-sized, bus-sized creatures. So absolutely amazing animals that rely on the salmon. And when I think of the gathering of the salmon, I'm thinking of the salmon, I'm thinking of the seals, the sea lions, the birds, but also, these large animals, these whales, which are living in this area because we have salmon. There's larger whales too. This here is a gray whale, which doesn't eat salmon directly, but are certainly closely connected in the ecosystem, and a real treat to observe. They actually will scoop food off the floor of the ocean, often like crabs and animals like that. And so when they surface, you often see a lot of mud that they've brought up to the surface from scooping their food from the floor. And this picture I just converted into black and white just to show those really beautiful details in the tail. And scientifically, the way that all these whales are identified to the individual for these large whales like humpbacks and gray whales is often through their fluke, because it's like a fingerprint. No two whales have the same patterning on their fluke. And most of this is actually scarring that develops over the whale's life. It can come from things like barnacles. It can come from, attacks by orcas or by sharks, or just by interactions with other whales rubbing against each other. But over their life, they develop these patterns on their tail, and it's quite remarkable. Here's a look at a humpback whale diving, another one of these beautiful large whales that lives in this ecosystem. And on the left there, you can see a common murre flying just behind the whale, again, to give a sense of size here. This whale's tail is probably 12 to 15 feet wide, which is just kind of crazy to think about just how large these amazing animals are. And recently this summer, while I was on Vancouver Island, and while I was doing some photography work around the salmon run and around the whales, on the way back from an outing into Klahoose with the Klahoose First Nations and into their territory looking for bears and salmon, on the way back to Campbell River, we started seeing some big splashes in the distance. And it was this whale here. This is a humpback whale known as Mathematician is his nickname. And he spends the summer feeding here in the Salish Sea, and is known to migrate to Hawaii in the winter. And right now this whale is probably nearing Hawaii if all is well. But this incredible humpback whale breached 15 times in a row. Something is this past summer, and I've never experienced anything like this in my entire life. So when a whale breaches once, it can be very hard to photograph. But when it breaches 15 times in a row, it makes the job quite a bit easier, and it provides you with a lot of opportunities to get the shot. So this is the first shot as it erupts out of the water, and here's a split second later, this bus-sized marine mammal leaping out of the water. And these humpback whales aren't eating salmon, but the same processes that govern the health of the salmon govern the health of these entire ecosystems. These whales might eat herring, they might eat planktons and krills, and the health of our oceans and our rivers is all very closely connected. So when we're protecting an animal like the salmon, which is a keystone species, if we do it right, it can have ecosystem-wide implications. In terms of these humpback whales, their largest threat in the past has been a direct hunting of the humpback whales. And the population's reached very low levels. I think hunting was banned in most places in the 60s and 70s. And only in the last 10, 15 years have we really started to see the numbers really surge again. And, prior to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you wouldn't see humpback whales very often at all in the Salish Sea. They were largely absent from this area, even though historically they were found here. So it's really fantastic that in the last few years, they've been returning to their ancestral feeding grounds here in the Salish Sea. And they are just such an incredible animal. And here's another picture of a mathematician as he breached out of the surface. No one knows why these whale breach. I like to say that only the whale knows why the whale breaches. But there's a lot of theories. Some people think they're communicating. It makes a lot of sound when you breach in the water like this. Maybe they're playing, maybe they're having fun. We don't know. In this case, there were some transient orcas in the vicinity within a couple miles. So potentially this whale was kind of letting out some kind of alarm to let other marine mammals know that there's some transient orcas in the area. But, we don't know. It's only a theory, but they sure are really incredible animals. So this will conclude kind of that ocean segment of the Great Gathering. We're so lucky here to live on the coast and where we have all these incredible marine mammals. But the journey of the salmon, while they do spend most of their life in the ocean, where we see them the most is in the rivers. So I want to head next to the rivers, the Fraser River and beyond, where the salmon are heading up to spawn. And probably the thing that I associate most with the salmon run, other than the salmon themselves, are the eagles. So this picture is a bald eagle with the sun coming down behind it as the sun was setting. But on the, we're very lucky to be close in this part of the world to the Fraser River, and in particular the Chehalis River estuary around Harrison Mills and the Brackendale area in Squamish are real meccas every fall at this time of year for the gathering of bald eagles. And when we think of bald eagles, we often think of them as these, majestic, very majestic and pleasant and regal birds. But I find when I'm photographing them, they're quite comical and they get into a lot of arguments, and I don't like to call any animal lazy, but these eagles will 100% of the time, almost 100% of the time, choose, a salmon carcass that's out rotting on the riverbank, rather than go after a living salmon, just because why would you? I mean, it's an easy meal when the salmon's already out on the riverbank. So, these eagles absolutely blow me away. I've been visiting the Harrison Mills area to photograph them since about 2012, 2013. So 7-8 years now. I'd like to get there this year, but, with everything that's going on with COVID, we'll have to see. But it certainly is a highlight of my year every year to go see these eagles and just look at that wingspan that they have. It's such beautiful birds, and it's such a sight to watch them. I love to just to wait. There's lots of wonderful viewing platforms and viewing sites that they have in the area there, and getting there first thing in the mornings when the eagles are all flying in. If I can get there before the eagles get there and just wait, I can watch them all come in, and I can be ready to photograph them. But my real favorite part of watching the eagles are watching the interactions. So I find often when, a couple eagles land together, it's usually because there's a fish or two that are lying on the riverbank. And that will in turn often get more and more eagles to fly in to try to scavenge a piece of the carcass. And they always get into fights. When one eagle lands, they'll always try to go right into where another eagle is standing on a salmon carcass, and there's almost always a really quick battle that ensues. Usually nothing happens, but it certainly makes for some intense action photos like these, and is quite spectacular to watch. It does tend to seem that the adult eagles are a little more successful at getting the salmon carcasses. They tend to bully around the juveniles a little bit, at least from what I've noticed. But a lot of these young eagles are even a little bit larger than the adults, I find. I've been told it's because they're growing their feathers, they have more blood in their feathers. And they're certainly matched in size, but the adults tend to be a little more aggressive when it comes to getting the fish. They're a little more experienced. And it's just amazing to watch these interactions, and they happen in a split second. So, you know, these photos that you're seeing are from years and years and years of photographing, but it takes a lot of patience and definitely a little bit of luck to capture these split second moments that occur. And sometimes you get an eagle that will just be apparently either maybe it's never seen a person before, or maybe they see people all the time, but sometimes you just get an eagle that just come and lands on a post right beside you, and they just seem to have no fear of people whatsoever. And this was one of those eagles. And often when they land, they let out a victory cry of sorts, and they shriek into the air. And it's quite neat to watch. And it's just such a great opportunity to look at those intricacies in their feathers. And you can see there's evidence of a recent salmon meal on the beak of this eagle here. There's a little couple pieces of flesh there. So I think the estimates are that the salmon run on the Fraser is attracting upwards of 30,000 eagles to the region every single year, which is really spectacular if you think about it. That is a lot of eagles. And you know, the numbers fluctuate year to year. In years when you've got more salmon, obviously you're going to see more eagles, which just goes to show how important of a food source it is for them. And in years when the water levels are low, when it's been a little drier in the fall, we tend to see more eagles too, just because then there's a lot more space for the salmon carcasses to wash up, and therefore there's a lot more room for the eagles to go down and feed on them. This here is around 3-year-old eagle, and I find some of the 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds get really beautiful, like almost golden eagle-like plumages, which make for some incredible photos and looks at them. And here is the close-up of those talons. These talons are obviously really important to the bald eagles for grasping onto the salmon and hauling them out into the riverbank. This picture was actually taken in Delta, where after the eagles are done feeding on the salmon, you know, a lot of them end up at the landfill in Delta and kind of spread out through the Delta Boundary Bay area. And I find often by February, March, some of these eagles, this was just taken from the Boundary Bay dike, but this eagle was just sitting. It was a bucketing rainy day. There was no one else there. This eagle was just sitting right up next to the dike. And I noticed these powerful talons. So I just zoomed in on the talons and framed them up and took this picture. But these talons are very important for grasping the salmon. And while they often eat the salmon on the riverbanks, they very frequently will pick up salmon that are light enough for them to carry and take them up into the trees. So here you can see an eagle digging into what looks like a very fresh salmon, almost so fresh that I wonder if potentially this one was even possibly alive when it caught it. But a very fresh salmon here that this eagle was eating. And by carrying the salmon into the trees, you know, a lot of scraps fall to the ground. They can't consume every little bit of the salmon. So these eagles are playing a role in fertilizing the forest. And there's so much research that shows that there's nutrients that these salmon carry with them from the ocean, like limiting nitrogens, that enhance the growth of forests. They can be seen in the growth rings of trees. There's even some research that has found that you can literally, like in the growth rings of trees, see the years when there's been a good salmon run. It's not only the eagles that come for the salmon. I love to, you know, we all love to watch and photograph the eagles just because they're such beautiful and large and charismatic birds. But probably the most abundant bird that's coming into the salmon are the gulls. These are a couple of glaucous wing gulls here interacting, and they are scavenging the carcasses alongside the eagles. And for the bird watcher, certainly like myself and like almost all of us here, it can be a challenge to identify them, but it can also be a real scavenger hunt, because often you'll just have like 1,000 gulls on the riverbank. And they're mostly glaucous wing gulls, but there's quite a few glaucous wing gull western hybrids. And then if you keep scanning through them, you see some Thayer's gulls and herring gulls sometimes, and ring-billed gulls. And, you know, occasionally over the years, you get lucky and see something like a glaucous gull, one of these rare species. So, you know, the eagles can be distracting, but the birder in me is always excited to look through the gulls and see what I can find. There's often a lot of herons around too. A fully grown salmon is obviously not something that a heron can consume, but there's a whole lot of salmon fry in these rivers too. You know, where the salmon are spawning, there's going to be a lot of small young salmon as well. And those small salmon are definitely something that the herons will go after. And perhaps my favorite bird that you see when the salmon are spawning is the American dipper. And at this time of year, I love to go looking for dippers because I find when you find them at this time of year in the streams, they're almost always going after salmon eggs. And it's just really neat to watch them jump into the river and swim around underwater and then come up with a bright orange salmon egg. So this is clearly a very important food source for them. You know, at other times of years, they're probably mostly eating aquatic invertebrates. But at this time of year, I find in rivers where they're spawning salmon, they seem to, when I'm watching them, catch more salmon eggs than anything else. And they're just such an incredible bird to watch. You know, the fact that they're an aquatic songbird, that, you know, this little bird is swimming around in these crazy strong rivers is really spectacular. And they have such a beautiful song too. It's not something I find you hear that often because we tend to see dippers more. I find the best time of year to see them is kind of the fall, winter, when they start to come down from the higher elevations. So that's not when they're singing, but sometimes you find one that's singing, and it's just a really, really beautiful song. And it's very loud, which I guess makes sense because if you're living in a raging river, you got to sing loud to be heard. So we've highlighted the ocean animals, we've highlighted the birds. Next, I wanted to go on to some of the terrestrial animals that are making use of the annual salmon run. And I think one that a lot of people may not come to mind right away at first, but an animal that has been very much documented, primarily here in British Columbia, to eat salmon are wolves. And, you know, we have special types of wolves here on the coast of BC, the coastal wolf, that are getting the vast majority of their food from, you know, ocean related sources. So they spend a lot of the time at low tide on the beaches along pretty much the entire coast of British Columbia where it's remote enough, you know, looking for crabs, looking for anything really that's washed up. They love to scavenge on carcasses, and they are just such incredible animals. The couple of times I've glimpsed them, it's just been such a magical experience. You know, they just come across as very sentient. Like they clearly know what they're doing. They're clearly intelligent. They clearly, I find to, you know, maybe I'm anthropomorphizing it too much, but I find they really show emotion when they're interacting. And this one here was a great example of that. It caught a mouse and it kept throwing this mouse up in the air. And then as it would land, it would pounce on it, and then it would toss it up again and it would pounce on it. Such an incredible thing to observe in such a beautiful animal. But in the salmon season, they do come to rivers. And while I've yet to personally see a wolf eating a salmon, I've certainly seen many pictures of them on the BC coast eating salmon. And perhaps as this wolf was wading along the shore of this river here, maybe perhaps he was keeping an eye out for salmon. Really a overlooked animal, I think, that definitely benefits very directly from the annual salmon run. And this picture here is of that same wolf, and I put it in black and white just to emphasize the details. But if you look here, you can see the wolf standing in amongst this old washed up log. And it kind of makes me wonder, you know, when I'm out in the wilderness looking for animals, there's got to be wolves and bears and all these animals that see me a lot more than I see them, because when they don't want to be seen, they will not be seen. A more traditional animal that comes to mind when you think of animals that are benefiting from the salmon run are bears. And similar to the coastal wolves, black bears spend a lot of their time in the non-salmon season out on beaches, flipping over rocks, looking for crabs and mussels and anything that they can find to eat. And I like this picture just because it shows how much the tide drops at low tide. And this was a very beautiful bear with a little bit of brown fur on the back. A really unique looking bear here. But when they're walking in the intertidal zone, I'm always amazed at how effortlessly they just flip over rocks, like these massive boulders that I could never even budge if I tried. They'll just flick their wrists and flip them over and grab the crabs underneath. Really, really amazing animals. But during the salmon season, fish are a very important food source for these bears. And earlier in the season, they will be less picky. They will kind of eat what they can get. Like, you know, a salmon like this was probably dead. I doubt it was alive when this bear scooped it up. It did scoop it up from the river, but it just looks, and if it was alive, it was barely alive. But if the salmon run is good, as the season progresses, they'll actually get quite picky and they'll start to only eat the most nutrient-rich parts of the salmon, like their brain and the eggs, and their skin, these very fatty, nutrient-rich parts of the salmon. And sometimes these bears just display incredible, incredible patience. This bear waited for hours for a salmon to come by. And I do not blame her for getting a little tired. She yawned quite a bit as she was waiting for a salmon to come by. And, you know, black bears have a very widespread range across North America, and it's only the ones that are lucky enough to live in places like this that have access to salmon. So it doesn't come that surprising to me that they don't seem to be the most skilled. Certainly they're a lot more skilled than I could ever do, but they don't seem to be as skilled as, say, like as grizzly bears when it comes to catching salmon. So you see a lot of this. They'll jump into the river after a salmon and completely miss. And then just like a dog, they'll come out and they'll shake all the water out of their fur. And it's really an incredible thing to witness. But occasionally they get lucky, or their skill comes in handy and they manage to catch a fish like this. And this does look like a very close picture, but I assure you this was taken with a big telephoto lens from a far distance away and cropped very closely just to emphasize the action and the fish that was going on here. Because the most important thing, especially when you're photographing animals like bears, especially during the salmon season, which is a time of year when they need to fatten up if they're going to survive the winter, it's important that, you know, we're having little to no impact on them whatsoever. So fortunately, with these bears, I was watching from a far distance, and it was like being a fly on the wall. It was so amazing to just watch them acting naturally, acting like bears, and splashing around in the river looking for salmon. This here is a pink salmon, which is one of the smaller of our Pacific salmon species. And this bear here caught a nice big coho salmon, definitely the catch of the day here for this black bear. So salmon are definitely a very important food source for these bears. We also have grizzly bears in BC, and like the black bears, they are for most of the year not eating salmon. This picture was taken in northwestern BC, and was driving along a road and spotted this blob in the corner. And often when always when I see animals by the road, I slow down because you don't want to hit them, for one. So I slow down and drift over, and I realized it was a grizzly bear. And I pull over and I lean out the window with my camera, and she walks up onto the road, and then these three little cubs emerge out of the grass. And it was just another one of those moments where you're like, surely these bears are feeling something when you look at the expressions on their faces, whether it's fear or curiosity, or just mystery, intrigue. Certainly they're feeling something. And it was very special to watch this mother grizzly take her three young cubs across the road safely to the other side. People often think of bears as predators, and they definitely can be predatory and certainly have the capacity to be dangerous if you're not being respectful of them. But I find they're more often just kind of, you see them like this, chewing on grass. They spend a lot of time chewing on grass. And like the black bears, they also come out onto the beach sometimes, the grizzlies, and they'll dig up clams and open up mussels and look for crabs. And here's a picture of a couple cubs. The mother was just off screen to the left. A couple of cubs working their way along the beach. But this past summer, I got the opportunity for my first time to see grizzly bears fishing for salmon in the Klahoose First Nations territory in kind of north of Powell River. It was such a special experience to visit the territory and to learn about the history of the land and the bears that have been there for so long and the importance of the bears in the ecosystem. And we were in these hides where you're just kind of overlooking the river. And this bear probably couldn't see us, but there's a good chance he could maybe smell that there were some humans nearby, and he just kind of stopped, sniffed the air, and then kept walking by. And here you can see a bear wading in the river. We did see bears catch a couple salmon, but unfortunately it was quite far away, so I don't have any pictures of grizzly bears with salmon in their mouths yet. But I did just get a nice series of photos of the bears wading in the rivers, and as they would walk, you would see all the salmon darting around in the river, trying to escape the path of the bear. And it was a bright, sunny day, which makes for difficult photography situation, especially when you're dealing with water, where every time there's a splash, things really get lit up and very bright. And when you're dealing with bears, which can be quite dark, it can make for a difficult photography scenario. But with the right, I find sometimes with the right specific scenario, you can find something that works. Sometimes these high contrast scenarios kind of make for a nice play between the light and the dark. And this bear here was walking through the shadow of the trees, but there was a little bit of sunlight filtering through the canopy and just kind of made for this nice highlight of the bear in the shadows. And just like the eagles, the black and grizzly bears play a very important role in fertilizing the forest, because these bears, pretty much every time I've seen a bear catch a salmon, I think, yeah, every time I've seen a bear catch a salmon, they carry it right into the forest. They don't even bother eating it in the river like the eagles sometimes do. And especially later in the season, if there's a lot of salmon, they will only eat small parts of the salmon. So the fish itself, as the leaves are falling in the autumn, gets reclaimed by the forest floor. And the nutrients from the salmon go into the soil and fertilize the growth of the trees, which leads to these beautiful coastal forests that we are lucky to have here. So, over the years, I've been observing salmon above the water since I was very young, and it's always been a real treat to see them work their way up. This is a ladder in Harrison Mills, this sockeye salmon making the leap up the ladder into the spawning beds. But I've always wanted to see what it was like under the water. Not just to even stick a camera under the water, but to actually be in the water with these fish and see what it is like. And thankfully, as I mentioned, this past summer, I got the opportunity to use an underwater housing for my camera. Here's what it looks like. This was sent to me for a few weeks. I got to use it, and it was just such a special experience. So this next photo I'm going to share is the only picture that I didn't take in this presentation. This picture is a picture of me, but I was just so amazed by this picture that my friend took that I wanted to share it. So that's me swimming in the river with just thousands and thousands of pink salmon on Vancouver Island. And being in the water with these fish, I've always been amazed by them, and I've always respected them just because, they're swimming up these strong streams into the inland ecosystems from the ocean. But to actually see them in action just brings on a whole new level of amazement and respect for these fish. So here's a picture that I took of just this huge school of pink salmon. There were probably a few thousand of them circling around in this deep river canyon. And I just love, one of the things I love about being underwater is that the sun rays become very visible when there's just a little bit of particles in the water. You get these really vibrant sun rays that light things up and just make for a really, really stunning scene. So to be moving with these fish through the river canyon was definitely very special. But these are kind of the staging grounds as they're heading upstream. But I also wanted to actually, visit some of the streams where they're getting closer to the spawning grounds, some of the more shallow streams. And this is where I developed even more respect for these fish, because these pink salmon are all swimming up this raging stream, right? But me, a human being, could barely hold my position in the stream, like holding on to rocks. I can barely hold myself still in this water. If I lose focus for one moment, I'll be swept away, which in these shallow streams isn't a real problem because it's only about knee deep. So I can always kind of stand up and get my footing. But to watch the fish just like seemingly effortlessly swim against the raging water while I'm struggling just to hold on is really, really something spectacular. And the one of the tricky things is that these fish are streamlined for a reason. They face into the water, so they're experiencing less resistance. But to photograph them from the side like this, I have to kind of be angled horizontally across the river, which makes me even more vulnerable to the force of the water. It's a lot easier to be facing into it than it is to be across from the water and having it hit your side. So this was probably some of the most physical photography that I've done in terms of just having to be paying attention, and my muscles are very active this whole time. But I think if there's one moral of the story that we get from salmon, it's that all the ecosystems are so connected, and these salmon are just critical for the survival of so many different animals and even for the growth of the forest itself. So I wanted to get a picture that combines the forest with the underwater environment. And after quite a bit of effort, this was the picture that I managed to get away with, showing the forest above the surface of the water and a group of pink salmon swimming upstream beneath the water. And this was one of my favorite pictures that I managed to take during the short time with the salmon. So, we're so fortunate to live in this part of the world, to have these types of natural phenomenons to witness, but also to support our whole ecosystem. I think, when a lot of people see a salmon, they just kind of see a fish living its life. But, the more time you spend immersed in their environment, you come to realize that everything is so interconnected. If it wasn't for these salmon, we wouldn't have bears, we wouldn't have whales, we may not even have as much forest. So, we have a duty to protect these salmon. There's a lot of over-exploitation of salmon, and here in BC, one of the issues that we have is these salmon farms, where they're raising Atlantic salmon in the Pacific Ocean, are having quite a negative impact on the health of wild salmon through, breeding of salmon parasites. So one thing that, we can all do is that if we're going to eat salmon, it's actually better to eat wild salmon, and especially if you can figure out where it comes from and if it's coming from a sustainable source, it's better to eat wild Pacific salmon than farmed Atlantic salmon. Perhaps the most sustainable is fish that is farmed on land that's not connected to other water bodies, but that's more expensive, so we don't see it as much. But either way, as naturalists, we all have a duty to be the to speak for these fish that can't speak themselves, and to make sure that we have a beautiful, thriving ecosystem here in British Columbia with our rich wildlife and our rich forests for generations to come. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for listening. It's been such a treat to present to you again. I hope that next time I present to you, it'll be in person, but whichever way, I will be more than happy to speak again. And if anyone has any questions, I would also be more than happy to answer any questions too.
Before I give people a chance to ask questions later on, I'll just say thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. It was even better than I was expecting.
Thank you.
They usually are. And I really do love the way that you see the whole big picture and how everything in the environment fits together. And that, along with the wonderful photography, makes for a very special experience.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much. And I'll make sure that I'm in touch with you so I can get your poster and your honorarium and stuff to you. And
sounds good.
I do hope that pretty soon that we will be able to get our Birds in Focus visual presentation back again with people there instead of on screen. And I hope that you'll still be able to do it, because you were supposed to do it this year. And of course we had to cancel. So I'm hoping that when we're able to get that back up and running, that we'll be able to count on you to present again.
Yeah, I would be so thrilled and honored to do it again. So
okay, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Those wolves, are they lone wolves or do they ever roam in packs?
So most of the wolves on the coast do live in packs. The wolves that I were photographing in those pictures were on their own, so they were lone at the time, but it's very likely that there's a pack in the vicinity. Like they'll often be in packs, and there'll be some adults taking care of the younger ones, but individuals will go out and explore on their own as well, and then come back to the pack. So there are lone wolves, but I would say probably most of them are in packs. I'm not a wolf expert, but that's my understanding anyways.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Who's asked?
The first few pictures of the wolves, they almost look like coyotes. They were a different color than the later ones. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so coastal wolves do tend to look, well, first of all, I guess there's a whole lot of variation in wolves. Even the coastal wolves can go anywhere from being black to white to brown to gray. And a lot of them, that first wolf that you saw that almost looks more coyote-like, that is actually pretty typical of coastal wolves. They tend to be a little smaller, a little more slender, a little more brown than a lot of the inland wolves. So it just seems to be a trait that a lot of the coastal wolves have. But there are also coastal wolves that just look like your classic like gray wolf as well. For now, they're considered to be the same species as gray wolf, but their behavior is very different from gray wolves in that they're mostly kind of scavenging for marine items rather than hunting. And they're genetically distinct as well, based on genetic research. So who knows, maybe they'll be their own species down the road.
Thank you.
Oh, I see the chat has some questions.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the comments. Which long lenses do I use? So the long lens that I own is the Canon 100 to 400 millimeter lens. The version 2, which is a great, very lightweight, versatile, sharp lens. I like it because it's light, but still gives me a lot of reach. I have had opportunities to borrow or rent 500 and 600 millimeters for some shots, including some that you saw in the presentation here. But the one that I own that I'm using 99% of the time is my 100 to 400 millimeter lens.
Any more questions for Liron? No? Liron,
Mark has a question.
yes? Mark?
Liron, when mathematician was breaching, on his chin, there was a light, I'll call it his chin, I don't know what else you call it. There was a light brown stuff. Do you know what that was?
Almost certainly like some algae. Often they get barnacles and then the barnacles get covered with algae. So just stuff living on the skin of the whale, basically.
And when they breached, do they land hard enough that they would do that to knock barnacles and stuff like that off their skin?
That is definitely one of the theories. I don't know as much with humpbacks, but like sperm whales are famous for after they breach, you apparently just find all this dead skin in the water. So it is one of the theories that it's a good way to kind of shed dead skin and get rid of like barnacles and parasites. So that is definitely one of the theories, yeah. I see a question in the chat. Do you do any rapid fire for the action shots? The answer is definitely always. I pretty much permanently have my camera in the fastest frame rate option available, which until I get a camera that can do like maybe more than 15 frames per second, I probably will always be using the fastest frame rate available, just because then you have a higher chance of capturing that best precise moment, especially with these animals that are moving so fast, like a bird flying or anything involving a splash. It's amazing how at like 10 frames per second even, so much changes between the pictures. It's quite remarkable.
Just wondering why he was called mathematician.
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. And I asked the captain as well, and he didn't know. But it's more of it's technically a nickname. You know, their official names are like numbers and letters. But mathematician is the nickname. I don't know what the reason for that is, but I'd be very interested in finding out.
Anyone else? Just push your space bar if you want to speak. I can't see everyone on here. No? Okay.
I have one question. Do you ever feel, I know you're fairly close, but wary of the bigger animals, but do you ever feel threatened by any, or have you been threatened by any?
It's a great question. So I think the main rule that I tend to follow when I'm photographing something like a bear is that if I'm purposefully looking for bears, I always will have someone with me. Ideally, someone who's even more knowledgeable and experienced with bears than I am. Even though I've seen hundreds of bears and been with hundreds of bears, like I'm only 20. So, you know, there's a lot of people who have a lot more experience than I do. That said, having seen hundreds of bears over the years, I've never had one, not even one, like negative experience with a bear where a bear has shown any sign of aggression or barely, like the most interest I've ever got from a bear was just like a stare type of thing. Like I've never been in any kind of scenario where I felt at all threatened or any kind of aggressive behavior or anything like that. And I think with animals like bears, at least from my experience, I know there's people out there who have been charged and attacked, but from my experience is that if you're being responsible and you're not approaching the bear, you're keeping your distance and you're being respectful, there's no reason for a bear to, in my experience, to act aggressive in any way if you're being respectful of its distance. You know, I find a lot in the media, there's a lot of stories of things gone wrong with bears, but almost every single time it's very clear why it happened. But that said, accidents do happen. Like sometimes you can startle. I've never been, maybe once or twice while hiking, I've just randomly startled bears, but they've always just ran away. And I find they do tend to be, you know, very afraid in general. Like they're not, I've never really found them to be aggressive or anything. And I think as long as you stay respectful of their distances and that type of thing, should be okay.
Liron?
Yeah.
I thought what you were going to say was make sure you're always traveling with someone who runs slower than you do.
Yeah, maybe. And also, you know, I always, if I'm in a place that I know is frequented by bears, I always carry bear spray with me. I've never had to use it. I've never even had to take it out. Like it's just in the side of my pack. But, you know, there's lots of precautions that we can take. And I think just having a general respect, you know, knowing, you know, not to approach bears and a general understanding of their behavior. Like it's usually pretty easy to see when an animal is acting unnaturally. You know, so as long as you kind of have that understanding, I've never had a negative experience. So,
Sharon.
It's you.
Leon, it's Ken here. I've noticed that a lot of your shots were taken from on water. Was this because you were across the water or you were on a boat or something? And secondly, do you do any video with these, or are they just another aspect of it?
Great question. So you're absolutely right that a lot of these pictures you saw were taken from boats. Boats definitely provide a great access point to you know, a lot of the animals and our coastal ecosystems here. So yeah, a lot of pictures from boats. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
With regard to, do you take a lot of this in video and then get stills out of that, or do you do video as well?
I absolutely do video as well. I was actually thinking about throwing in some videos into the presentation, but I just find on Zoom, it's very difficult to share videos because it tends to be kind of stop motion-y, like choppy when you try to share videos. So I thought, you know, we'll save that for a future presentation. But I find I definitely take a lot of videos, and I'm finding myself actually getting more and more into videos lately. I think it's a very dynamic storytelling medium, so it's definitely something I'm looking to do more of as well in the future.
I like to do a lot of video myself.
Very nice.
Which was your favorite picture of the ones that you showed? I like the one with the water and the trees that showed both the, you know, I just want one was your favorite.
That one is probably up there for me. I think like the challenge that goes into a photo like tends to stick with me more. And I find with photographers a lot, often their favorite pictures that they've taken are the ones that were hard, even though sometimes when you look at a picture, like you can't necessarily tell. But I would say the salmon shot with the above and below water is just a shot that I've wanted to take for so long. And that was quite a physical challenge to actually take. So I would say that was definitely up there in here in terms of the ones that I'm the proudest of.
Well, that seems to be about it, Liron. Thank you so much. Your photography is absolutely superb, incredible. And to see the interconnectedness between the land and the water and the creatures that live on our coast in and out, it was just a great presentation. So thank you. And someone had their hand up. I think they wanted to say something. Annie, did you?
No, that's
no. Okay.
I'll give them 2 thumbs up.
Oh, okay. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you again, Liron. We look forward to having you in our hall when we're there too, and meeting in person. That would be great.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you all hopefully in person sometime soon.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night.